Good morning.
Good morning.
Good to have you here. And as Mark said, we are in the beginning of a new series called God's Story, Your Story, becoming the man that you were designed to be in the greatest story ever told. The purpose of this series is to help you become, as I said, the man God created you to be. And that's our commitment here at Awaken Heart, because that's God's design for you and me as men to function in the world that He created, to be the men He created us to be. And that manifests itself in a certain way. The focus of this series is really threefold. First of all, it's to help us understand God's larger story. God is telling a story, and it's a big story, and we might have heard about it, we might know about it, but we want to help you fully understand what that story is. Second, we want you to also have an awareness of your own story. Mark said he didn't even know his story. You say, well, how can you not know your story? I was born, I did this. That's your history. Your story is something else, and most men don't know their story. Most people don't understand and know their story. They're not aware of the story in which they live. And so we want to help you not only understand God's larger story, but to become aware of the smaller story you daily are living in by how you think, how you act, how you respond, how you speak. And then thirdly, what we want you to do is help you as you understand God's larger story and you are aware of your smaller story, to help you understand how to live into God's larger story so that you begin to see the entirety of your life story in the context of God's larger story. It doesn't change the events of your past. It doesn't change the events of your life, the circumstances of your life, but it puts it in a context that allows you to see that in a very different way, and therefore then to think and to act and respond in a very different way. So that's what we want to do. And one of the reasons we want to do that, as we saw last time, is that if we live only out of our smaller story, the Bible says we are foolish. But if we learn to live out of God's larger story, which we saw last time is really the fear of the Lord, it is what the Bible says is a wise way to live. So as men, we don't want to be foolish, we want to be wise. And so to do that, understand God's larger story, help you become aware of your smaller story, and then how is it that we come to live in to that larger story. And so with that in mind, that purpose in mind, the outline of the series is first half is going to look at obviously God's story. Last time we saw that history is God's story. Today we're going to focus on how God is telling His story. Next time, which is going to be probably the most important time when it comes to understanding God's story, is the story God is telling. The story God is telling. And then the second half of the series will focus on your story, how your story was formed. And then the fifth session is going to be not all stories are created equal. There are very dysfunctional ways to live because there are very dysfunctional stories. And we want to talk about that. And then lastly, the most, of this section, the most important, how is it that I learn now to take the story that I've come to understand that God is telling, the story that I've become aware of that I am telling, and how do I take my story and learn to live it into God's larger story and become the man God has created me to be in the greatest story ever told. So that's the outline. If you weren't here last time, let me give you a summary. If you were here last time, let me give you a summary. We said really two things. First of all, we said story is important. You know, why do a series on story? Well, story is important. We saw all of life comes to us as a story. It's not a math problem to be figured out. It's a story to be lived into. Story is how we daily relate to each other. You ask somebody, hey, how did you do? And they just give you the word fine. What? Is that what you're looking for? No, you get frustrated. What are you looking for? a story. How did you do is a story prompt. Tell me the story about it. So story is how we relate to each other. And then lastly, we saw that story is how we make sense of all of life's events and circumstances. We unconsciously connect the dots of life to form a story. And we do that all the time. So story is important. And then we said last time that God is telling a story. And we said it's the single account that explains creational reality. It's a worldview. It's an outlook on life. And everybody has one. And what we're saying is God has one, and he's been telling this story since the world began. This story is it's God's autobiography about how, as creator, he interacts with his creation. And then lastly, we said that it is a story centered in God's purposes and glory that's being told throughout human history. It's not about man, although mankind is an important character in God's story, but the main character in this story is God himself. And thus, his story is about his glory, it's about his purposes, it's a story centered in him. And so if we're going to talk about God's story, we got to have a definition of God's story. And so we offered a definition that we're going to kind of build everything around, and that's this. God's story is his seen and unseen movement in the world. Okay, it's both seen and unseen, by which he is sovereignly orchestrating all of human history towards a future glorious day. Everything that's happening is moving towards a specific day. And what is that day? It's a day when God's good but broken creation will be fully restored and made new. You know, we have this desire within us for utopia. We know that something is wrong in this world. It's not the way it's supposed to be. And everybody knows that, and everybody has a philosophy or a way of thinking about how that utopia can be accomplished. Through religion, through government, through whatever it might be. But God is telling a story that is moving towards a day when everything will be as it was created and designed and functioning to be. And he's doing this, we're going to see, through Jesus, God's unique Son, Israel's promised Messiah, and the world's true Lord. That's when we talk about God's definition, or God's story, that's the definition we're going to be operating out of, okay? So we also noted one more thing, that this story that we defined here, God's story, provides 4 things that you and I and every human being need in order to move forward into life, to thrive in life, and to flourish in our lives. 4 things this story provides. A lot of stories, as we're going to see, are not created equal. This story provides everything we need. A lot of stories don't. What does it provide? God's story, as defined, provides a fixed foundation for our identity, our beliefs, our convictions, and our actions. It gives us a foundation on which to stand. And especially that's needed when we have such a squishy foundation to stand on today, isn't it? It gives us a fixed foundation. It gives us a transcendent purpose, something bigger than ourselves for our life, our relationships, our opportunities, our work, our possessions. It also gives us genuine meaning for all our experiences in life, both good and bad. And lastly, it gives us real hope for a good future that's not only worth waiting for, but it's also worth suffering for. God's story, as we define, provides this foundation, purpose, meaning, and hope for life that a lot of the stories today are not providing. And so with that in mind, session 2, History is God's Story, session 1. Session 2, How God is Telling His Story. I want to begin with a question, and that question is this. Are you telling your story in the same way God is telling His story? Are you telling your story in the same manner God is telling his? That's the question, okay? Now, why this question? Why not another question? Well, this question, because of this. For you and I to live into God's larger story, and that's really what we want to see happen in our lives. For us to live into God's larger story, we must be telling our smaller story in a manner compatible with the operating system of God's larger story. God's larger story has a way that it was created to function and to operate. Just like a computer, it has a way that it was created to function and operate. It's an operating system. And for us to operate in that system, we have to be able to interface with that system. And to tell our story in a different way than God is telling his story will prevent you and I from interfacing with God's operating system of his larger story. Okay? So why this question? Are we telling our story the same way God is telling his? Because if we are telling our story in a way that isn't able to interface with God's system, it doesn't matter how much we know our story and how much we understand God's story, we won't be able to live our lives into his larger story. And so then the question, how is God telling his story? Okay? Well, God is telling his story in two distinct ways. First, God is telling his story in the context of time. Now, what is time? Well, in the Bible, time is always viewed as linear movement, forward movement. Time is moving forward, okay? And if that's true, what that means is this. Time is going someplace, right? If it's moving forward, it's going someplace. It has a destination. It also means that time is moving towards something, meaning it has a goal. It also means that time has an endpoint. It's not cyclical. It doesn't just keep repeating itself. If that's true, that time is linear in movement, then what does that tell us about God's story that's being told in time? What does it tell us? If time is forward movement and God is telling his story in time, what does it tell us about the story of God? Well, it tells us that God's story has a beginning. In other words, God has acted in the past. It tells us that God's story has a middle, that he is involved in the present, and it also tells us God's story has a what? An ending, that God is directing the present and the past towards a good future, towards an end. It doesn't keep repeating itself. God's story is moving someplace, and where is it moving? Towards the day when everything will be made right again. And that's why we said last time, history is his story. Okay? Now, contrast that view of time, the biblical view of time, that it's linear movement, with the pagan view of time. What is the pagan view of time? Well, if it's not linear movement, what is it? Cyclical. It's cyclical. It keeps repeating itself over and over and over. This means that time is going nowhere. It has no destination. It means that history is repetitive, that it has no goal. It also means that everything is random. It has no purpose. No destination, no goal, no purpose. If you think of reincarnation, no destination, no goal, no purpose, other than just go out of existence. If you think of what we're being told today in the whole critical theory, critical race theory thing, there is no forgiveness for the past. There's no hope for a future. It's only power, revolution, power, revolution, power, revolution. That's a pagan view of time. It's going nowhere. It just keeps repeating itself. Now, additionally, in the pagan view of time, if we're thinking about ancient times, everything revolved around New Year's Day. You've heard of Yuletide? That's part of a pagan festival. That's the pagan holiday, New Year's holiday. Why did it revolve? Why did the pagan view of time, which is cyclical, revolve around New Year's Day? Why? Well, the New Year's Day in pagan cultures, and still today, is the most important day of the year. There is much drinking, revelry, partying, and also it was the highest and most holy religious day of the year. It was the one day that everybody went to the pagan temple. And why did they go? Well, to see the main event. And what was the main event? Well, the main event was a public sex act, X-rated, whereby the high priest and priestess performed a sexual act in front of everybody in the local temple. Now, guys, that was a day when men went to church. They had no problem getting there. In fact, they were probably there early to get a front seat, not a back seat. Now, why that? Well, that public act of sex in the pagan culture symbolized two things. It symbolized the death of the past year, and it also symbolized the birth of a new year. Death of the past year, the birth of a new year. Why the symbolism? Why did it symbolize death of the past and birth of the new year? Why? With the past year dead, if we could kill what happened last year, then the memory of the past year no longer existed. And if the memory of the past year no longer existed, then the worshiper's past no longer existed, right? Just think, if you could kill the past year, not only would you not have to think about what happened the last year, all that it happened, but you wouldn't have to think about what happened to you or what you did this past year. It'd all be gone. And if that was all gone, if it no longer existed, then you would be free to enter the new year without the baggage of the past year. You see how that works? When you have baggage from the past, what does that prevent, guys? It prevents movement forward. It keeps you stuck in the past. It keeps you free from being what God has created you to be in the greatest story ever told. And so here's the question. Why did they need to forget the past? Why? One reason. Because the pagans had no way to deal with two things. First, past guilt. Second, unresolved suffering. Think of this past year, 2020, and things that you might have done that you feel guilty about, genuinely guilty about. How do you get rid of that guilt? Or think of things that might have happened, suffering, things that have happened unfairly, unjustly to you, and you have no way to deal with that. How do you deal with that unresolved suffering? Well, the pagans had no way to deal with their past guilt or unresolved suffering. Why? Because their larger story, the story that they lived out of, had no meaning, redemption, or healing for the past. In the same way, today, what we're being told in our culture today with the critical theory is that there is no meaning, no redemption, nor healing for your past. It's just going to keep repeating itself. And so what do? Well, you find a way to, get rid of the past, or at least ignore it, or at least, allow it to not be at the forefront of your mind, and so you get binge watching on Netflix and you do all kinds of stuff. And thus, because their larger story had no meaning and redemption and healing for the past, to deal with their unresolved past, they viewed time as cyclical. That's how they dealt with their past, by seeing time as cyclical. 1 year stops and it's gone, the next year begins. In other words, they dealt with their past by choosing to forget their past. See that? They dealt with their past by choosing to forget their past. You say, well, so what? What does the pagan view of time have to do with your story? What does the pagan view of time, that time is cyclical, have to do with your story? Remember, God is telling a story that's linear. The pagans are telling a story that's cyclical. Well, the answer is this. As men, we naturally tell our stories more in a cyclical, repetitive way and less in a linear, forward way. We tell our stories in a way that is more compatible with the pagan view of time and less compatible with a biblical view of time. You say, well, how is that? For example, we're telling our story in a pagan-like manner when you and I get stuck in destructive cycles that we passively expect will just keep repeating themselves. What are some of these destructive cycles, you say? Well, addictive cycles like porn, drugs, alcohol. Well, I'm going to stop doing that porn, but on the inside you passively know what? Well, it's just going to happen again. I'm going to give up the alcohol, the drugs, but passively we just know, well, it's going to happen again. That addictive cycle, it just keeps repeating itself. We're not moving forward. How about behavior cycles? Something happens, rather than taking responsibility, we blame. I know I shouldn't be blaming, but it happens again. I can't take responsibility, so I blame, or I find excuses. Or I blow up, or I pout. That's a way. I don't like pouting in that, but it's a way of dealing with things in a way that I don't have to. It just keeps repeating itself. How about relationship cycles? You live dishonestly. I got to stop being dishonest, but something happens and I just go back to it. It just keeps repeating itself. Or conflict avoidance. Or shaming. I got to stop shaming people, but here it is again. What I want to do, I don't do, but what I don't want to do, I do. Oh, wretched man that I am. There's that cycle that I just keep repeating itself over and over. Guys, we're telling ourselves, we're telling our story in a pagan-like manner when we get stuck in these destructive cycles. But usually what we tell ourselves is this: it's just who I am. You can't expect me to change. Why? It's because who I am. Likewise, we're telling our story in a pagan-like manner when we not just passively choose to forget the past, but when we actively choose to forget the past. How do we do that? By blocking out portions of our past. By romanticizing our past. Oh, my past was great and wonderful. Everything was great in my past. And you talk to the guy and you find out that it really wasn't. That he had a lot of tragedy and trauma, but he romanticizes it. By dismissing the power of a past event on our life. Oh yeah, my parents got divorced, but that didn't hurt me. When it did. Or by distorting the details of our past. My dad he'd spank me, when in fact, your dad would beat you up. Why do we do this? Because we want to say our life really was good. And if my life was good, then what? I don't have to face the past. I can choose to forget it by passively getting into these addictive cycles or by actively choosing to simply forget it. And why do we do this? Passive or active forgetting? We do this so that we might escape the unresolved pain of our past, the guilt of our past, and the shame of our past. And guys, we all have it. We all have it. And as we said in the clip, it doesn't go away. It lives inside us. And when you try to bury it, it's just a matter of time before it comes back to what? To haunt us. That's the whole point of Hakuna Matata in The Lion King. What does it mean? No worries about what? About what happened in the past. No worries. Forget the past and everything will be okay. That's life, isn't it? That's what we're told today. That's what we're told. And so what are we saying? Well, what we're saying is this. When we passively or actively choose to forget our past, we are telling our story in the same way the pagans tell their story. We are telling our stories also, when we do it like that, in that cyclical manner, we are telling our story in a way that is incompatible with God's larger story. It cannot interface with the way God's story is moving forward. And when we tell our story like this, we're telling a story, like the pagans, that was devoid of healing from our past, devoid of peace in the present, and devoid of hope for the future. And guys, that's what people are looking for today. That's what men are looking for today. Healing, and there is no healing with what we're being told today. Peace, and there is no peace with what we're being told today. Hope, when there is no hope in what we're being told today. God's story offers all these things. When we tell ourselves our story like the pagans are telling their story, and like the culture is telling its story, there is no healing, peace, or hope. Now contrast that with how Paul told his story. Listen to what he says in 1 Timothy. He says, I was once a blasphemer and a persecutor and a violent man, yet I was shown mercy. What's he saying here? Notice, Paul never forgot his violent, shameful past. He's telling him about it, isn't he? But Paul's past was resolved by God's mercy. It's not a past that's unresolved. It's a past, a violent, shameful past that has been resolved by the mercy of God through Jesus. And as a result, Paul's past was not only resolved, but it was able to be used to advance the very story of God itself. In other words, Paul was telling his story in a way that is compatible with God's story. Why? Because Paul's story is not being told in a cyclical manner to avoid unresolved past, but what? It's being told in a linear movement way that aligns him with the story of God. It's going someplace, just like God's story is going someplace. And he is viewing his story in the context of God's story. Now, how that linear movement is unfolding? Okay, we're back, and we still have some guys getting some stuff here. That's okay. It's good to have. We got a good crew here this morning, and full house, yeah. Young guys. Yeah, there are a lot of younger guys here. A lot of guys brought their sons too, so it's good to have you here. Well, we are talking about this morning how God tells his story. And the first part we looked at, God tells his story with linear movement. Okay? Now, this section, this part of our session this morning, we're going to look at that God, while he's telling his story with linear movement, he's telling his story with three main themes. There are three main themes that predominate God's story. And what are these three themes? Well, I'll give you just a big overview of what we've said here. God's story has three themes: innocence, tragedy, and resolution. Innocence, tragedy, and resolution. And if you know anything about literature or stories or narrative, to have a good story, you need exactly those three themes, right? Innocence, everything is good. Tragedy, something bad happens. Resolution, we want to get rid of the tragedy and bring resolution. In God's story, we're going to see that innocence is in Genesis 1 through 2 in Eden. And then tragedy is the fallen world, Genesis 3 through Revelation 20. And then resolution is found in the new creation, Revelation 21 through 22. So in a big picture sense, those are the three themes and how they fit into just the general narrative of Scripture. Innocence is in the beginning. Tragedy is the middle of God's story, and resolution is the end of God's story. Innocence is the past age, tragedy is our present age, and resolution is the future age. And all this is being told in human history by linear movement. Now, where do you and your story and me and my story fit into this? Well, if we would want to put ourselves on this timeline, this very general timeline, we are somewhere in the middle of God's story. In other words, all we have ever known in the overall story of God is tragedy. Tragedy began in the garden in Genesis 3, and it won't end until Revelation 21. And we were born into that, we live in that, and if Jesus doesn't come prior to that, we will die in that. That's where we are in the story of God, okay? Now, let's look at these three themes, and then what we want to see is how they fit into our own story as well, okay? So innocence in any story is characterized by a couple things. First, it's a time of goodness, peace, and naivete. What's naivete? It's a lack of what? Awareness. Everything is good, everything is right in the world. Not because it is good and right, but because what? We're just not aware of it. It's a life absent of tension, conflict, or chaos. If it's there, we're not aware of it. It's a place of wonder, beauty, and tranquility. Again, all is right in the world. And again, it's shalom, the way the world is supposed to be. That's innocence. If you think of a story that starts out in innocence, think of the Lord of the Rings. Where is innocence in the Lord of the Rings? It's where? It's life in the Shire. Man, you know, everything, it's just wonderful in the Shire. How about innocence in God's story? Where's the Shire in God's story? Well, the Shire in God's story is Eden, right? That's the setting. It's the Garden of Eden. Eden is a place of innocence, not perfection. One of the reasons I say that, because there was something that wasn't good in the garden. What was it? Man was alone. Wasn't good, okay? So it's a place of innocence, not perfection, and it's set in the midst of moral darkness. What we're going to see next time is that the world wasn't perfect, and then something bad, that when we come to Genesis 1 and 2, God is creating, and he places the world and the garden in the midst of moral darkness. There was something going on prior to the beginning of the story. And the characters we see here in innocence are Adam and Eve. And what we see, what we're told about them, Genesis 2:17, they have no knowledge of good and evil. They only know what? Good. Everything is wonderful and right in the world. And as a result of having no knowledge of good and evil, they have no self-awareness, fear, or shame. And we know that because Genesis 2:25 says, and they were naked and not ashamed. It's like my little grandson. You know, he'll get in the bathtub and all his glory, he has no shame because he has no self-awareness. He still lives in a state of innocence. And so as the story begins, Adam and Eve are present with God in the goodness of Eden, totally unaware of the evil that lay outside the garden. Okay? That's how the story begins, the theme of innocence. Now let's think about innocence in your own story. When does innocence in your story begin? Innocence in your story begins at birth. Everything is good in the world. All you do is feel a little discomfort and you cry, and what happens? You're fed, you're changed. You don't even have to say anything, it just happens for you. Everything is good in the world, and as you grow, it's just like a dream world, you know. Barney, I love you, you love me, and everything is right in the world. As children, we believe everything is good, right? Everybody is good. That man over there that's in the van parked along the road, it's asking that little boy, come here, little boy, and see my puppy, or he's got a sucker. Oh, that's a good thing, right? As children, we believe everything is good. Why? Because we are naive and unaware of evil. We have no self-awareness or no shame. That's how our story begins. So here's my question. Why is innocence so important to not just any story or God's story, but why is innocence an important theme in your story? Why? Reason? Innocence opens your heart to the goodness of God in the midst of the evil outside. If we came into the world, and we're living in a world of tragedy, right? We're born into that age. The present age is one of tragedy. But if we're born into that, and that's what we start off with, how would we ever know anything good? Innocence opens our heart to know goodness, to know what God is like. A childhood robbed of innocence, therefore, is going to lack a context for understanding the goodness of God. When a child is robbed of his innocence, when a child is robbed of that time of everything is wonderful in the world before he's ready to see that the world outside is something bigger and different than the world inside, there's something that happens in his heart that struggles then to have a context to understand that God is good. And so I think God has arranged it so that our stories begin with a time of innocence in this age of tragedy, so that we have a context for understanding the goodness of God. For without that, we would have no context for understanding what goodness really is. So, God's story begins in the Shire, begins in Eden. Our story begins in the Shire, begins in Eden, in a sense, where everything is good, innocence. The second theme is tragedy. Now, what is tragedy in a story? Tragedy is the shattering of innocence, isn't it? Tragedy is the intrusion of evil from the outside. Tragedy is the disruption of shalom. It's not the way I thought it was supposed to be. And innocence is shattered, and intrusion and the disruption of shalom happens by means of an inciting incident. A spark is lit, and the tragedy takes place. Now, what's the purpose of tragedy in a story? Because tragedy has a purpose. What's the purpose of tragedy? Tragedy in any story creates an uncomfortable tension, doesn't it? Everything was wonderful and fine in the Shire. Now, something happens, and there's this tension. And it awakens the heart's desire to restore shalom. I don't like this. I want it to be the way it was, but I can't go back to the past. And so it begins to determine and set the plot. What is the plot of a story? It's the forward movement. That takes you where? To the end, resolution. It motivates the characters to act, right? Tragedy moves the story forward in search of a good ending. And let me ask you guys, if you watched a story or watched a movie and all it was just, I love you, you love me, and everything is wonderful and fine, how long would you watch that movie? What makes a good movie good? Conflict, tragedy. Tragedy causes you to listen. Tragedy draws you into the story. What's tragedy? What was the tragedy in The Lord of the Rings? How long would have you watched Lord of the Rings if all you saw was what they were eating and the little hijinks they were pulling with, the fireworks and everything? How long would you watch that? It'd get boring pretty quick. Where does tragedy come in, The Lord of the Rings? With the introduction, what's the inciting incident? What's introduced? The ring. The ring. And all of a sudden, here comes the conflict. And it forms the plot of the what? The Fellowship of the Rings. They come together to do what? To bring resolution to the problem that the ring is causing. What's tragedy in God's story? Tragedy is introduced in Genesis 3 with the entrance of who? The serpent, which forms the plot for Genesis 3 through the rest of the Bible. Now, what's the role the serpent plays in the story of God? What's the role he plays? What's his character? Well, his role is the villain. He's the antagonist. Every good story has a villain, right? The serpent is the villain in God's story. He provides the story's conflict by introducing another way to live in God's world that is independent from God. Here's another way to live, if you're interested. And how is he described? Genesis 3:25 says this. Through 3:1, it's really 3:1. I included that. You'll see in just a second here. The serpent was more crafty than all the wild animals the Lord God had made. How does it describe him? He's crafty. The word means shrewd or cunning. So we have the villain introduced in chapter 3, verse 1, and he's introduced as a snidely whiplash. Crafty, shrewd, and cunning. Okay? That's his role. Now note the contrast of characters. Remember, the main character is God. In the beginning, God created. But then we're introduced to important characters, but not the main characters, Adam and Eve, but now the new character, the villain. Notice how God's story contrasts Adam and Eve and the serpent. Adam and Eve are described in Genesis 2:25, the last verse of Genesis 2, and they were naked and unashamed. The next verse, chapter 3, verse 1, because there was no skip here, there was no chapter break, they were naked, and now here's a serpent, and he is what? He's crafty. The Hebrew word for naked is aramim. The Hebrew word for crafty is aram. They kind of look the same. That's intentional. It's a Hebrew word play. And what it's telling us is this: Adam and Eve are innocent and naive. in their nakedness. They are oblivious to the dangers and traps around them, to the evil outside. Whereas the serpent is cagey and cunning. He is aware of the dangers and traps around the couple, and guess what he's going to do? He's going to use those to do what? To trap them. In their innocence, he, in his craftiness, is going to trap them. In their nakedness, the couple didn't know where the traps were. In his craftiness, the serpent knew how to trap the couple. In other words, as the villain of the story, the serpent is going to cunningly use the couple's naivete against them. Okay? How? I want you to see three things here. The serpent is going to speak, and his words are deceptive words. He speaks deceptive words. Genesis 3:5. Has God really said you shall not surely die? God knows your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good from evil. Now, notice, the serpent shrewdly invites the couple to know what God knows. And what does God know that they don't know? The difference between good and evil. They're innocent. All they know is the good inside. God knows the good and the evil outside. And so Adam and Eve naively believe the serpent's cunning deception. And what do they believe? We can exist independent of God. There's another way to live other than centered in God. We can live a life independent of God, centered in us. A story not for His glory, but for our own. A story not for His purposes, but for our own purposes. In fact, God can revolve around us. Second thing to note is what the knowledge of good and evil bring. They eat it, and what happens? Well, Genesis 3:7-8 says, as they eat it, their eyes were opened, and they knew that they were naked. And so they made coverings, and they hid themselves. After eating, it says that their eyes are open to know good and evil. They know that there is good, and now they know that there is evil. And with opened eyes, it says that they lose their innocence and they suddenly grow up to the evil around them. They're not like little children anymore. They've become adults in the sense that they know good and evil. But notice, in growing up to evil, Adam and Eve unexpectedly experienced something that the serpent didn't tell them they would experience. And what is it? Fear and shame. And suddenly they have a new need that they've never had before. I gotta hide. I gotta hide. And so instead of being like God in their knowledge of good and evil, living a different way to live apart from God, suddenly they get stuck. Suddenly they turn inward. Suddenly it's no longer safe to be human anymore. Third thing I want you to notice, the deceptive words of the serpent, the unexpected response of knowing good and evil, and thirdly, the Creator's response to the couple's rebellion. What does the Creator do? Genesis 3:24, then the Lord drove them out of Eden and stationed the cherubim and the flaming sword to guard it. What does this tell you? Eden was the place of innocence. Now they were to go out of it in the power of God to do what? Into the world. To tame it, to bring order to the chaos. But now they're cast out of it, never to return again. In other words, they were to go out and come back, to walk with God, to eat of the tree of life, and all that was there so they could go out again, dependent on God, serving God. That's what it was to be like, to go out into the world. But now they have no way to do what? To be restored. Now